Yo, it's Michael, bro.
Thank you again for that introduction, Dan, and hello everyone. Recently, I've decided to beat all of the FromSoft games. So that's the Souls trilogy, Demon Souls, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. Uh, I got into this series when I was in my sophomore year of high school, and ever since I played my first one, I fell in love with the series. I remember beating the Soul of Cinder for the first time, first try, and this is my first final boss of any Souls game, and that just the feeling of beating a boss in the Souls games is so uncomparable to anything else in the gaming industry, and I feel like most people that have played Souls games would definitely agree with that. So I figured today I would take some time as a semi-informed, semi-skilled gamer to rank all the Souls games from my least favorite to my most favorite. I feel it's worth saying if I had done a more traditional style tier list where I had like do it in like S tier, A tier, my least favorite game would probably still at least be B tier, and I just want to say that because when I talk about my least favorite game and what I think is the worst game, I'm just saying it in terms of relativity. And yeah, also another side comment: as far as Demon Souls and Bloodborne go, I can't record any footage from that on my PS5 right now, so I'll be using a little bit of other fill-in footage for those games. But without a further ado, on to my least favorite game. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this decision is very surprising for anybody that's played a Souls game in the past. Um, Again, I'd still say I enjoyed parts of Dark Souls 2, although for the most part I wasn't enjoying my time too much. I still think the game is B tier though, at least at bare minimum. I enjoyed the individual level design of some areas. The Forest of Fallen Giants was kind of nice, and I think that Drangleic Castle also looked very nice. Uh, some of the bosses were nice too. I think the main one that really sticks out to me is the Looking Glass Knight. I really like that boss just as a concept, really. Um, Other games have had phantom enemies that are summoned by the boss, but at least personally, when the phantom broke through the mirror, I thought it was a bit cooler than like the old monk from Demon Souls. My problems with the game are, what most people's problems are. I don't like that adaptability exists as a stat. Uh, Having to upgrade your iframes is kind of silly. It You can either dump all your points into it and just have so many iframes that you don't even really have to think about your dodge timings, or you could be timing it perfectly, but your iframes are not leveled enough, so you didn't dodge actually. Uh, I know that it is meant to fit into the game's theme, but I don't really like how the levels don't make sense when you transition between them. What I mean, like they don't really have a coherent flow about them. My main issue with it not having coherent A/B traveling is that, at least personally, it was kind of challenging to remember what leads to where. Like I didn't have anything in one area that would help me remember where something led. It was just like you're in No Man's Wharf, and bam, you're in Lost Bastille now, and it's like okay, I guess I'm just there. I also thought that a lot of the NPCs were kind of just forgettable. The Emerald Herald, she's not very interesting, but I'm giving her a pass because it's my understanding that there was a lot of cut content surrounding her, but others are kind of just bland and annoying. Uh, for instance, the blacksmith and Majula. Like I know in Dark Souls 1, Andre's basically just there, kind of the same way that the blacksmith is in Dark Souls 2, but in Dark Souls 2, the dude is just like rude and annoying too. He locks himself out of his house somehow and is like, "You go get my keys so I can smith." And then you do it, and he's like, "I can smith now. I guess I'll make things for you." And it's like, "Oh, okay, I guess." Uh, as far as the difficulty of the game itself goes, most enemies, I mean, it's not anything groundbreaking to say that the game's main difficulty spike just comes from throwing mobs and mobs of enemies at you, and most of the bosses aren't fairly difficult either. Uh, it's very easy to get overleveled in this game as you play more and more. So the main issue is really just getting to the boss. Going back to the adaptability point I was saying before, upgrading that stat increases both your iframes and the speeds of actions that you can do in the game, like drinking Estus, casting spells, and whatnot. And and the speed of the game is in this such a weird spot to me, because it's faster than Dark Souls 1, yet somehow it still feels slower in some aspects. Like drinking an Estus just feels slow. And the movement itself feels faster, like Dark Souls 3, but they still lock you in place when you do certain things, like drinking an Estus, for instance. And it just feels like, obviously, it is literally in between Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, but the movement just feels like it's stuck in this weird spot between Dark Souls 1 movement and Dark Souls 3 movement, where it's like the worst of both worlds, and I'm not particularly a fan of it. I think Zero Lenny on YouTube has a pretty good take on like the difficulty of this game. He talks about how both in world with the hags at the opening when you make your character, and out of world with the constant death count that's like tracking how many players died. This game is really boasting about its difficulty, and it just seems like it didn't do any of the effort to make the game actually difficult. It just wanted to say it was, so it threw a bunch of enemies at you, because most of the bosses aren't very difficult, and in a 1v1 situation, most of these enemies aren't very difficult either. It's just the way the game is made is like a perfect storm of all bad aspects of the system that it's running on, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll close off with just saying that, again, there were parts of this game I did enjoy, but I just wasn't feeling the majority of this game, and I've heard good things about the DLC. I've heard good things about, I don't remember the name of the dragon that you fight at the end, but I've heard really good things about that, and it could be very good, but I wouldn't know, and I don't care to know, just simply because I didn't like this game enough to make me want to play through that DLC. Um, but as we move off of this game into the next game, the enjoyment definitely spikes. Coming in next, we have the Demon Souls remake. I don't have too much to say about this remake, other than that I really enjoyed my time with it. Visually, the game is very awesome. The graphics and animations both. Uh, I really appreciated that they changed the riposte animations for a lot of the weapons from the original. You know, like now when you have like a pole arm, you don't just like stab it through an enemy's stomach as you would any other sword. You have a unique animation for it. My main dislike for this game is how easy it is to be overleveled. Getting overleveled fast is like a common problem I find in a lot of these games, but Demon Souls probably has it the worst. I struggled fighting the first bosses of each level, so like Phalanx and Leechmonger and such, but after I beat them, the rest of the fights were a breeze. I flew through Stonefang Tunnel immediately after beating the other bosses, and having gone through the whole level, I had a bunch of souls to level myself up and then be over-leveled for the next level. After beating the first boss, it took me one night to beat the rest of the game, and other than other than it being really easy to get over-leveled, I like how the weapons felt to use. Uh, I also liked having to use different weapons with different damage types. I know other Souls games have different weapons that have different damage types, but in Demon Souls it really felt like it was important to have decent weapons of multiple types, especially in Stonefang. I know this is a moment I made for myself, but my guy, he was using a great axe and a longbow, and when I got to the Storm King, I was already prepared. I didn't grab the Storm Ruler, and I think my experience was greater for it. I felt like I was prepared for the battle rather than just being like given the way to insta win. Um, I also had a short sword that I used to stab the enemies in Stonefang, and it just felt cool needing to be prepared rather than damage type not really mattering much as it does in other games. Also, side comment for the gameplay that's being used right now in the video. This is John Wick vs. Lario at 3 a.m. gone wrong at jedgenedge.com. Exclusively at jedgenedge.com, so please check it out. It's a very well made game and very funny. Alright, and now we can move on to our next entry. Right, this may come as a surprise, Bloodborne being in the bottom half of the rankings, but don't get me wrong on that though, because this game was still very fun for me. There was just a couple gameplay things that I didn't really like But before I get into any of that, I would like to first open up with the fact that this game is absolutely beautiful. Aesthetically, it is probably the strongest game FromSoft has ever made. I mean, I ordered a cosplay for this game just because I love the look of it so much. All the weapons in the game feel very different from each other, which is something that you don't really get in the other Dark Souls games, where it makes your build feel really personal, and your weapon isn't just going to be a reskin of like a different weapon with the same animations. You know, like how you in Dark Souls there might be like four different swords that you have, and all of them have the same animations, and they all just have different stats. NPC quest lines also pick up here. Um, quest lines like Eileen the Crows, and Alfred's are very fun to play out, and those two are probably my favorites in the game. But as for the reason this game is so low, I'm very disheartened to say it's the gameplay. My understanding of the core gameplay idea for Bloodborne is that you're meant to fight as ferociously as your enemies. I get that from how your health comes back if you deal damage after recently taking damage. That and the beast pellets, where it builds the meter as you do damage, and the higher the meter is built, the more damage you do, which really just rewards you even more for being aggressive. And considering the aggressive gameplay style that they want you to have with this game, I find it antithetical that the game is full of enemies that don't allow you to be constantly engaged with them due to either size or speed. A lot of enemies have attacks that really punish getting too aggressive. You know, it'll be giant sweeping AoE attacks and things of the such, or a jumping attack that they jump off screen and you just have to get the timing down to be able to dodge, but it just completely breaks up the flow of your combat. I've heard other creators make mention of the large number of enemies that are too big to be even seen in full when you fight them, which makes it challenging to play. It makes it challenging to play the way the game wants you to play, and you know, combining the two issues, enemies that you can't really see in full with sweeping AoE attacks and jumping off screen, it's just really hard to play the game the way they want you to play. And another problem that, again, is prevalent in most of the games on this list, it was getting over-leveled quite fast. After I fought Rom, none of the fights were very challenging, as I was able to beat the Wet Nurse first try, and Gurman and the Moon Presence on the second try. But yeah, to close this section out, still, I love Bloodborne very much. It is still an amazing game. But it just wasn't in my personal taste, I suppose. But moving on to the next game. I'm sure the decision to have Dark Souls 1 be the middle of the pack isn't quite as shocking as having Bloodborne in the early half, but, you know, some people might find this a bit surprising regardless. But what's it? Dark Souls 1 is such a masterful game in so many aspects, but at least in my opinion, it does fall short a lot in the later game, but I'll continue on that later. After Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 introduced me to one of my favorite ways that FromSoft design their games, which is that they aren't afraid to make missable content. Places like the Painted World and Ash Lake are such incredible atmospheric areas that it's possible for you to beat the game and never even know about them, and just having that layer of missable things and things that you really have to go out and look for really makes me feel like FromSoft can value the intelligence of their player base, which I feel is something that a lot of games nowadays don't really do. Another of my favorite aspects of the first Dark Souls is the amazing story it introduced and the lore of the world it takes place in. The way Dark Souls and most of the FromSoft games on this list unravel their stories is a method that I've definitely fallen in love with, and for me it all started here. Getting wrapped up in the community by watching VaatiVidya explain the lore of all these games and the secrets within them over and over until I could recite them by memory is a process I loved going through. I think the stories in these games get a lot of flack for being hard to understand, but I think compared to other games where you have to read codex entries for half an hour, or games where the story and themes kind of get spoon-fed to you, needing to search and theorize and get your own understanding of the story as you play is, in my opinion, a far superior method of storytelling in video games. As for my thoughts on the actual gameplay of Dark Souls 1, everything's really enjoyable to me, although as you'll probably be able to tell knowing the three remaining games, I prefer the faster Souls gameplay, although the methodical nature of Dark Souls 1 isn't entirely lost on me. My main, and I say this in air quotes, issue with Dark Souls 1 is usually what it gets the most praise for, which is the interconnected world the game has. Now, I think for the early game, the world works really well. What's it? I'll accept my role as a broken record of the Souls fan to tell you that the feeling of unlocking passages through areas you didn't even know were connected is a very wonderful experience that so many games since Dark Souls 1 have tried to emulate. However, as I said previously, where this falls apart is the late game after you get the Lord Vessel. I'd say for the most part, Lost Izalith and the Tomb of the Giants are alright areas, but when you get to the actual bosses themselves, they're kind of poorly designed. The Bed of Chaos is notoriously a terrible boss, where the goal is to just throw yourself at it until you get lucky enough to not get smacked around like a rag doll. Gravelord Nito is a little better, but the entrance to the boss having such a large amount of fall damage after a loaded boss run is a pretty scummy start, and then once you actually get to fighting him, assuming you have decent levels, it's not even really that hard. The Duke's Library, the curse status is so tedious to get rid of that it sucks that it's almost impossible to avoid when you're going there, because you have to die to Seath for the first time. That's assuming it's the first playthrough and you don't stock up on Purging Stones beforehand. The Four Kings aren't really too interesting to me, as I view them as more of a DPS race than a boss, but I don't really have any complaints about it though, because I still very much enjoyed the actual area of the New Londo ruins. Opening the floodgates was really fun, and fighting the Dark Wraiths was also really fun. They're very interesting and cool-looking enemies. Unfortunately, though, with the final boss, Gwyn, he's kind of a pushover, just because if you can parry like 5 to 6 times in a row, it's laughably easy. Overall, I think Dark Souls 1 is an excellent game, but it still just does leave room for improvement, and I think the following games in my list definitely improve the system. So, Sekiro is the FromSoft game that I have the least amount of knowledge of. I wouldn't call myself a master of any of the Souls games, but I'd say that Sekiro's most certainly the one that I have the least amount of skill in. Still got the true ending though. Uh, so it kind of leaves me in a weird spot where I really love this game, but at the same time I don't have too much to say about it. Uh, I remember when I first got this game though, and I was parrying the first couple enemies. As you could, this isn't my first run, but as you can see me parrying in the footage right now, and just I had this constant stank face on the whole time because it was so satisfying to just fight basic enemies in this game, which I think is a positive that's unique to this game out of any Souls game. In other Souls games, fighting basic enemies usually gets to a point where it's either tedious or it's just too easy to be fun. So like you would either just kill them instantly or you would just run past them because they don't mean anything. But in Sekiro, it's just really fun to fight everything. The quality of the boss also ramps up like astronomically for me at this point, with a lot of the boss gimmicks like really working well here. The best they have ever that FromSoft has ever done before. The gimmick boss, for instance, think like the Ancient Wyvern from Dark Souls 3 or Dragon God from Demon Souls, works way better in Sekiro than it does anywhere else, in my opinion. With the Great Serpent being both terrifying to go up again at first, while also being so cool to take down. The Divine Dragon was also an epic fight that I'd label as a gimmick fight. Other bosses that really stuck out for me were Gyobu Oniwa, the Guardian Ape, and Genichiro. All being perfect fights in my opinion. I don't think there is anything that you could do to improve them. This game is what I feel to be the hardest out of all the FromSoft games, but the challenge never outweighed the fun of grappling around, parrying, and unlocking new skills, and allowing for the ceiling to be raised even more. The gameplay of this game, I mean, just you could see, just by watching it, is so different from anything FromSoft has ever done before. It's just, they really perfected their craft when they were making this game, and there is no simpler way to say that. Oh, Elden Ring. There aren't many parts of this game that I don't enjoy. The only thing that I wish they changed was that I wish they changed the name of the Sword of Night and Flame to the Sword of Ice and Fire, because, come on, if you're going to have George R. R. Martin work for the writing of this game. You gotta at least have the reference in full. Uh, I think my favorite aspect of this game that comes with the open world is just the ability that this game gives you to go somewhere else. And that might like sound weird, but in a Souls game, that really does mean a lot. If you're having trouble with a boss, or if you just want to go look at something different, you can go somewhere else and still be contributing to the main goal of the game. Uh, Unless I'm forgetting something, I don't think there are a lot of other Souls games that give the player such an ability. In Dark Souls 1, I suppose there are different places for you to go before you get to Anor Londo if you ever get really stuck, but you still need to go ring both bells. Any other thing you might do in the meantime is either not able to actually be finished until you beat Ornstein and Smo and get the Lord Vessel, or it's just for farming enemies just to get levels. Torrent feels a little bit janky sometimes. Just a small amount though, and I think otherwise I'd say he still feels pretty good to use. Uh, the story of the world was also really amazing to learn about while I personally prefer the story that Dark Souls 1 and 3 had a bit more, I really do like what came from this game. Elden Ring also probably has the best quest lines in any of the Souls games, with Ranni's, Alexander's, Irina's, and Selen's being among my favorites. The game, although still being challenging for the most part, definitely feels like the most beginner-friendly Souls game to me. Checkpoints before every boss, and the ability to make a powerful build out of any stat you want, or weapon you want, the summoning bell, and how easy it is to travel the lands, all point me towards this conclusion. The bosses are epic, and such a thrill to fight in this game, and obviously this game comes with a high number of bosses, and not all of them are built equal, but as far as the shard bearers go, and I'd say a large number of the side bosses go, they're all beautifully made and so much fun to fight. And speaking of beauty, this game is downright beautiful. Uh, I appreciate a lot of the weapon balancing FromSoft did after launch, especially the way they were able to change weapons for PvP while keeping the same for PvE. That is a very nice feature that allows things like Rivers of Blood to get nerfed for PvP, but still allow people to use them in their busted state for PvE. I'm super excited to see what happens with the DLC for this game, and who knows, after the DLC comes out, Elden Ring might steal first from my current favorite spot, which leads us to, unlike how I opened with Elden Ring, instead of there being very few things I don't like about this game, there are absolutely no parts of Dark Souls 3 that I dislike. I love every single thing this game has to offer. The continuation of the story of Dark Souls 1 was done amazingly to me, and continuing the themes of the dangers of not being able to let go of the past worked very well, I felt. I also need to get a little confrontational here, because I'd like to say that the world design of Dark Souls 3 is something that I think is objectively better than that of Dark Souls 1. Each level is made with the same care and intricacy as Dark Souls 1, with secrets to find and shortcuts to unlock, but it trades off the interconnectedness of Dark Souls 1's world with the fact that you don't get over-leveled by the time you're 3/4 of the way through the game. The linear progression makes the challenge scale much more naturally because, unless you rush to do the DLC first, you won't have a chance to fight a bunch of enemies and bosses in between the main objective. In addition to that, though, the game does give room to do things in a slight change of order, like how you can decide to either fight the Deacons or go straight to the Abyss Watchers, as well as having side areas that you can save for late game, like the Consumed King's Garden or Archdragon Peak. But, if you do have the skill and you're able to go there before you get to the late game, it is rewarding. And I don't want to be like another YouTuber who felt that in order to praise their favorite Dark Souls game, they needed to constantly critique the original, but I do want to say that I feel like Dark Souls 1 has way too many meat riders. I'm not denying or claiming that Dark Souls 1 did not earn the status it has, but to act as though the game is flawless is pretty deceitful. I recognize that, of course, Dark Souls 3 isn't flawless either, but it improved on what I thought were the weaker parts of Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls 3 also houses what I believe are the best bosses in the series, excluding maybe the Deacons and the Cursed Rod of Greatwood, with the Pontiff, the Dragon Slayer armor, the Dancer, and the Abyss Watchers being some of my favorite. Similarly, I think that they have some of the best boss themes in Dark Souls 3, Like the Soul of Cinders boss theme. When I was fighting it for the first time and it started incorporating motifs from Gwyn's theme, I got chills, and I still get chills listening to that to this day. And you also can't forget about Vort's theme. I think the Nameless King might be one of the greatest bosses they've ever done, too. As well as Midir being the greatest dragon fight they've ever done. Even after Elden Ring, I'd still stand by that. And before Elden Ring came out, I would have said that Dark Souls 3 had the greatest NPC quest, with Grey Rats and Seekwards and Anries being up there with the greats, but, Elden Ring did take that, and I will give Elden Ring that. I love the movement in this game. I know, even though this is kind of complained about, the fact that the player has so many opportunities to roll and make these knee-jerk decisions, I really enjoy that, and I also enjoy it because the bosses can still keep up with it. They still can punish improper timing and over-rolling, which I think is really good balancing-wise and shows very good game design, and they didn't just decide that you can roll all the time for no reason. Alright, and that's all I really have to say about all these games. Yeah, FromSoft continues to meet their high expectations every time they make a new game. I still have yet to try Armored Core 6, but I do plan on playing that eventually. But I hope you all enjoyed me talking about the Souls games. They are my favorite games probably ever made, aside from Team Fortress 2, but separate genres, so I don't really put them in competition. This video took me a little bit to make, so I hope you guys all enjoyed it, and feel free to comment whether or not you disagreed or agreed with anything I said. I'd be happy to discuss it with people down there, and thank you for watching. Have a good day, guys.